The dust did not fall here, it breathed. It was the land's slow, weary exhalation, a fine red powder that rose with the indifferent sun and settled with the cold, knowing stars. It coated every surface, a second skin on the weathered planks of the lone cabin, on the cracked leather of the water bucket, on the silent leaves of the one stubborn, skeletal tree that refused to die. Wind was the only voice on this scorched patch of earth, a low, mournful prophet that spoke of emptiness and time. It scraped against the corners of the small house, whispering through the ill-fitting window frames, a constant reminder of all that was gone. Inside this fortress of silence lived a girl named Mai Ling. She was not a girl in years, for the lines of grief had carved a woman's map onto her young face, but she was a girl in the way she had been frozen, trapped in the amber of a single, terrible night. Her life was a ritual of quiet gestures. She moved with a deliberate slowness, as if any sudden motion might shatter the fragile piece she had built from the wreckage of her world. In the pale light of dawn, she would tend her meager garden, her fingers tracing the thirsty roots of the squash and beans. She would draw water from the well, the rope groaning like a man in pain. She would mend the same fraying seams on her father's old coat, her needle a tiny silver fish swimming through coarse brown wool. She did not speak. Not for years. The words had been burned out of her, not by the fire that had consumed her family, but by the whispers that followed. The whispers of the townsfolk, their faces pinched with suspicion and fear, blaming the strange herbs of her mother, the foreign prayers of her father, for the sickness that had swept through their valley before the fire became their excuse. The flames had taken her home, her parents, her brother. The town's hatred had taken her voice. It was safer to be a ghost, a silent spectre on the edge of their world, a thing they could pity from a distance and forget up close. Every evening, she would light a single lamp and sit at the rough-hewn table. 3 chairs sat empty across from her, their backs to the cold stone hearth. They were not just vacant wood, they were presences. She could feel the weight of her father's steady gaze, hear the echo of her mother's humming, see the ghost of her brother's mischievous grin. The silence in the cabin was not empty, it was full of their absence, a ringing void that was both her torment and her only company. She had learned to live inside this bell jar of memory and dust, her heart beating to the slow, funereal rhythm of the sun rising and setting. She expected nothing more. The world had taken all it could, and in return, she had given it her silence, a wall so high and so thick that no one could ever breach it again. She had forgotten that the world was larger than the town, that there were other kinds of silence, other kinds of ghosts that walked the earth. She had forgotten that even the most barren land can be crossed, and that sometimes, help is sought in the last places one would ever think to look. The land held its breath, and waited. They appeared as the sun began its bleed across the western sky, 10 figures emerging from the shimmering curtain of afternoon heat. They did not ride horses or announce themselves with noise. They moved like shadows detaching from the earth, great, tall men who seemed to carry the weight of the mountains on their shoulders. They were Apache, their faces impassive, their dark eyes holding the vast, patient emptiness of the plains. They walked with a weariness that went bone deep, not of a single day's journey, but of a lifetime of being hunted. At their center, 2 of them carried a third on a crude stretcher of hide and branches. Mai Ling saw them first as a distortion on the horizon, a ripple in the fabric of her solitude. She froze, her hand gripping the handle of the well bucket. Fear was a cold stone in her stomach, a familiar weight. Her first instinct was to run, to bar the door, to vanish into the deeper shadows of her home. The town's warnings, the stories of savage raids and brutal men, echoed in the silent chambers of her mind. But she did not run. She watched. They did not approach the house with aggression, but with a slow, deliberate purpose, their steps measured and respectful of the space around her small homestead. They stopped a great distance from her fence, a silent, imposing line against the setting sun. One man, taller than the rest, his face a mask of exhaustion and fierce responsibility, took a single step forward. This was Cale. He did not raise a hand in greeting or in threat. He simply stood, and his gaze met hers across the dusty expanse. His eyes were not cruel. They were filled with a terrible, pleading exhaustion. They were the eyes of a man who had exhausted every other option, a man who had come to the door of his enemy because his enemy was the only one left. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards the man on the stretcher. Myling could see him clearly now. He was young, his body trembling with a fever so violent it seemed it might shake his spirit from his flesh. His skin was slick with sweat, his breathing a shallow, ragged sound that was swallowed by the wind. They were not warriors on a raid. They were fathers and brothers, and they were desperate. They were begging, not with words, but with their very presence, with the raw, unspoken vulnerability of their predicament. In that moment, Myling saw not the savages from the town's fearful tales, but a reflection of her own history. She saw a family facing annihilation, pushed to the edge of the world, seeking a flicker of mercy in a land that had offered none. The whispers of the town faded. The fear remained, but something else rose to meet it, a stubborn, deeply buried kernel of her mother's compassion, her father's quiet strength. They had taught her that a hand offered in need transcended language, race, and fear. To turn them away would be to betray the very ghosts she communed with every night. It would be to agree with the town, to admit that some lives were worth less than others, to become the monster they had always believed her to be. She let go of the bucket handle. Her movement was small, but it was a tectonic shift in the landscape of her life. She walked slowly to the gate of her small fence, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. She did not open it. She simply stood before them, a small, solitary figure against the immensity of their presence. She looked at Cale, then at the sick boy. Her throat was tight, the muscles stiff from years of disuse. She nodded. A single, sharp dip of her chin. It was her first word in years, a word spoken not with her voice, but with her entire being. The relief that washed over Cale's face was almost invisible, a subtle softening of the hard lines around his eyes, but to Myling, it was as loud as a prayer of thanks. She turned and walked back to her door, leaving it open behind her. An invitation. The fire in the hearth was cold, but she would light a new one. The days that followed unfolded in a shared, profound silence. It was a different kind of quiet than the one Myling had known. Her old silence was a sharp, brittle thing, the sound of absence. This new silence was heavy, dense, and alive. It was the silence of mutual observation, of respect, of a truce with the world. Myling moved through her chores with a new, unspoken audience. She crushed herbs her mother had taught her to find, the bitter, healing scents filling the small cabin. She brewed teas, cooled cloths for the sick boy's forehead, and spoke to him in soft, meaningless tones, the sound of a human voice itself a kind of medicine. The boy's name, she learned without a word being exchanged, was Narco. One of the men had traced it in the dust with a stick. The 9 other men became silent guardians of her homestead. They did not enter her house unless invited by a gesture. Instead, they inhabited the space around it, their presence a formidable, calming shield. They moved with an economy of motion that made the frantic, noisy energy of the townsmen seem clumsy and wasteful. One of them, a man with a deep scar across his cheek, spent 2 days meticulously mending the section of her fence that had been broken for years, using scavenged wire and his own leather ties to bind the posts together until they were stronger than before. Another found her wood axe, its handle split, and spent an entire afternoon shaping a new one from a piece of seasoned hardwood, his knife moving with the patient skill of a sculptor. They sharpened her tools. They cleared rocks from her garden. They took turns sitting on the low ridge behind the cabin, their gaze fixed on the distant trail that led to town, their stillness a promise of protection. Communication was a language of gestures and shared tasks. When Myling offered them food, a thin stew of vegetables and corn, Cale would accept it with a slight bow of his head, his eyes meeting hers with a look of solemn gratitude. She saw the old, faded scars that crisscrossed his forearms, a testament to battles fought and survived. He, in turn, would watch her hands as she worked, her own fingers calloused and marked by labor. They were speaking a language of scars, a dialect of survival that needed no translation. One afternoon, a young boy from a neighboring farm, no older than her brother had been, wandered close, chasing a jackrabbit. He stumbled near the ridge where one of the Apache warriors sat, still as granite. The boy didn't see him. The warrior did not move, did not startle the child. He simply watched until the boy gave up his chase and turned for home, then he melted back into the landscape. It was a gesture of profound restraint, a quiet act of peace that no one in the town would ever believe possible. But the town was watching. On a rare trip for salt and flour, My Ling felt their eyes on her, colder and harder than before. The whispers were no longer whispers, they were low, angry murmurs. Sheriff Brody stopped her on the wooden sidewalk, his face a mixture of pity and frustration. "My Ling," he said, his voice low. "Folks are saying you're harboring them. The Apache. It ain't safe. For you or for us." She looked at him, her face a blank canvas. She bought her flour, her salt, and walked away, his words trailing behind her like burrs. Her silence was no longer a shield of grief. It was now a weapon of defiance. When she returned, Cale was waiting by the fence. He had seen the dust cloud from the sheriff's horse. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. She met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was enough. They both knew the town would not be content with warnings. The peace was temporary. A storm was gathering, and her small, silent homestead was about to become its center. The storm broke on a Tuesday. The sky was a searing, cloudless blue, the kind of sky that offered no comfort, no shade. A plume of dust on the horizon announced their arrival long before the sound of hoofbeats reached the cabin. It was a different kind of dust cloud, thicker, angrier than a single rider. My Ling was outside, hanging washed cloths on a line, when she saw it. Nako, now strong enough to sit up by the door, saw it too. He let out a low whistle. Instantly, the 9 warriors appeared, moving from the shade of the tree, from the side of the barn, from the ridge where they kept their silent watch. They gathered, not in a panic, but with the grim readiness of men who had been expecting this fight their whole lives. They were unarmed, their hands empty at their sides. This was a choice. A statement. Cale stood before them, his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. My Ling did not retreat into the house. She walked to the newly mended gate and stood beside it, her hands clasped behind her back. She would meet them here. She would not hide. The posse reined in their horses, a disorderly crowd of a dozen men, their faces a mixture of fear and bravado. Sheriff Brody was at their head, his badge catching the harsh sunlight, looking more like a shield he was hiding behind than a symbol of authority. Beside him sat Preacher Silas, his face pale and tight with a righteous fury that seemed to burn behind his eyes. His Bible was clutched in his hand like a weapon. "My Ling!" Silas's voice was shrill, cutting through the heavy air. "You have brought a curse upon this land. Sheltering these godless heathens, these murderers. In the name of all that is decent, you will deliver them to us." Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "It's the law, Miss Ling," he said, his voice lacking any conviction. "We can't have them this close to town. It's for everyone's safety. We'll take them in peacefully." It was a transparent lie. The men behind him held rifles, their knuckles white. There was no peace in their eyes, only a thirst for a violence they could call justice. My Ling looked past them, at the faces of the men she had known her whole life. Men who had bought herbs from her mother, who had shared a nod with her father. Now they looked at her as if she were a viper in their midst. The memory of the fire, of the smell of smoke and the sound of her mother's screams, rose in her throat, hot and acrid. But this time, it was not just grief. It was rage. A cold, clear rage that burned away the last remnants of her fear. For the first time in 7 years, she opened her mouth to speak. The sound that came out was quiet, raspy from disuse, but it carried across the dust with the weight of a commandment. No, just one word. It hung in the air, impossibly loud in the tense silence. Preacher Silas's face contorted. "Blasphemy! She sides with the devil's own." He spurred his horse forward a step. In that instant, My Ling moved. She stepped through the gate and stood directly in front of Cale, placing herself between the guns and the men she now considered her family. She was a small, fragile barrier, but her stance was as unyielding as the mountains behind her. She raised her chin, her dark eyes meeting the preacher's, and for the first time, she did not look away. Her silent gaze held more power than all his holy words. It accused him. It judged him. It stripped away his righteousness and left his hatred bare for all to see. The men in the posse shuffled, their bravado faltering. They had come to fight savages, to put down a threat. They had not come to shoot a lone, unarmed woman in the back. Sheriff Brody looked from Myling's resolute face to the impassive, dignified line of Apache warriors standing behind her, and he saw not a gang of killers, but a quiet, unbreakable wall of solidarity. His authority, built on the shifting sands of public opinion, crumbled. He was a coward, and in the clarity of her defiance, he finally knew it. The standoff stretched for a lifetime, measured in the frantic beat of a dozen hearts and the slow, steady rhythm of 11 others. The wind picked up, swirling the red dust around their feet, as if the land itself were growing impatient. It was Preacher Silas who broke. His fury, faced with a resolve he could not comprehend, curdled into sputtering indignation. "This is not over," he hissed, his voice thin and reedy. He wrenched his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it whinnied in protest. He galloped away, his righteousness trailing behind him like a tattered flag. His departure broke the mob's spell. One by one, then in pairs, the other men lowered their rifles. They avoided Myling's gaze, their eyes darting to Sheriff Brody, who sat frozen on his horse, a man hollowed out by his own weakness. Without another word, he turned and led his defeated posse away, their retreat a slow, shameful procession that was swallowed by the dust. They left behind a silence that was different yet again. It was the silence of victory. Of survival. Of a bond forged and tested in fire. Myling stood for a long moment, her back to Cale, until the last rider had vanished over the horizon. Then, her strength gave out. Her shoulders slumped, and a tremor ran through her body. A large, warm hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. Cale's hand. It was not a gesture of pity, but of profound, shared strength. She did not flinch from his touch. She leaned into it, just for a second, drawing from his stillness. That evening, they did not eat inside. They built a fire in the open yard, a bright, crackling blaze that pushed back the encroaching darkness. It was not the hungry, destructive fire of her memory. This fire was a beacon. It was warmth and community. They sat around it, Myling, Narco, Cale, and the others. She brought out the last of her tea, and they shared it from a single tin cup, passing it from hand to hand in a slow, reverent circle. No one spoke. No one needed to. The empty chairs inside the cabin had finally lost their power. Her family was not a collection of ghosts in a silent room, it was this circle of scarred, weary survivors, sitting under a vast, open sky, their faces illuminated by a living flame. The Apaches stayed for another week, until Narco was strong enough to travel. Their departure was as quiet as their arrival. At dawn, they gathered by the gate. Cale approached Myling. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a single, perfect hawk feather, its base wrapped in intricately beaded leather. A symbol of vision, of protection, of courage. She took it, her small fingers brushing against his calloused palm. He met her eyes and spoke her name, his voice a low rumble. Myling, it was a thank you, a farewell, and a promise, all in one. She watched them walk away, melting back into the landscape from which they came, until they were nothing more than a memory against the rising sun. She was alone again, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the resonance of a choice she had made, a connection she had forged. She went back inside her cabin, the hawk feather in her hand, and for the first time in years, she opened the window, letting the morning air, the voice of the wind, and the light of a new day pour in. If you have ever felt the world press in, threatening to extinguish the small, steady flame of who you are, if you have ever been silenced by the judgment of others, made to feel like an outsider in your own life, then you know that the most profound courage is rarely a shout. It is a quiet whisper of defiance. It is the steady hand that mends a broken fence, the shared cup of water in the desert, the choice to stand for someone when the entire world tells you to run. We all build walls to protect the wounded parts of ourselves. We surround ourselves with the ghosts of what we've lost. But the real question is not how high your walls are. It is whether you have the strength to open the gate when a stranger, weary from their own battles, arrives begging for help. For it is in that moment, in that single act of trust, that you do not just save them. You save yourself.